Welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Last time we covered much of the world in the current situation, and today there are more things to look into. And in the future we will be doing Oroville and the supramental action on earth, and then these core values that the Mother has given us. So we have a lot to do in the future. Sraddhalu, the East is growing in importance and strength, as the West seems to be facing somewhat of a decline. How do China and Russia fit into this scheme?
Sri Aurobindo describes the transition of the age as the age of individualism and reason fades. He describes a passage through what he calls the subjective age, where the mind turns from its superficial external objectivity to a more subjective exploration, both of oneself and of the world. And it is that subjective exploration, if it goes all the way to the soul, that would awaken to the spiritual age. And so we are in this transition where large parts of humanity are turning to the subjective, not yet to the spiritual. A small part of that is also turning to the spiritual, so like a precursor for the greater age to come. But the countries which have already a tradition of a subjectivity and a depth of exploration of subjectivity will tend to have an advantage in this transition. Most of the East has been oriented in that direction, especially in the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years or so. In our discussions, we have been looking at a much larger span of history. And so 2,000 years is not much. And this turn to the subjective is normal in the East. The result is, as the exploration and the struggles of humanity fail in the face of an objective resolution and are forced to turn to a subjective exploration, these spaces will come forward rapidly. I give an example in my own experience. There is an ongoing exploration of consciousness in the field of science, coming from many directions. It's interesting that it is interdisciplinary. Artificial intelligence, as it seeks to develop intelligence, hits a barrier where intelligence cannot be real unless it is conscious and self-conscious. And so the question of what is consciousness becomes critical. The exploration of biology, similarly, as it begins to observe the working of the body, tissue, its responses, although assuming consciousness to be a product of the nerves, very quickly comes to a barrier where it says the operations of consciousness cannot be explained purely by brain. There's something else happening which is controlling the brain rather than being a product of the brain. And so it hits this barrier. Is consciousness ruling the brain, or is brain causing consciousness? And the evidence is towards the former. And so the question of consciousness has become critical in neurobiology, and that's the cutting edge. If you take any other field of exploration, somehow or other, the edge of consciousness is the barrier. And it is there that the whole thing seems to get stuck. I've attended a few conferences, international conferences, exploring consciousness, artificial intelligence, and through many of these different gateways. The one thing I saw was those who came with a very hardened mindset were those who were used to the very objective type of science, objective type of exploration. And they've been repeating the same thing that they spoke 20 or 30 years ago.
Empiric knowledge.
Yes, yes. And what they believed in, they're stuck in the belief, although the evidence has moved much further. Those who are able to sense and make breakthroughs are those who are already in a subjective space. And these two have become so distinct that one does not see eye to eye with the other. So, it just as an example, we were in a dinner conversation before the major conference, and all these scientists were present. And so I was somewhat new, many of them didn't know me. And so the first question they asked was, which camp are you in? And it's not stated that way. What do you think of the hard problem? Okay, that's the question. The hard problem in artificial intelligence is precisely this. What causes consciousness? What causes self-awareness? It's the hard problem because it's hard. It can't be resolved. So, well, I said, obviously, it is consciousness is what is prior to brain processes. And there was this whole group, and you could see it on their faces. Oh, they cut off. And then the other group, they aligned. And straight away there was this split. It was so obvious. It seems to be something like this. So it's difficult to say the East and West today, because in the West there are equally people who have turned to the subjective space consciously. I had occasion to meet somebody who is in the Institute of Noetic Sciences, was earlier principal scientist and now I think he's director, Dr. Dean Radin. And in the conversations we had, he's doing a lot of experiments on parapsychology and measuring them in the lab space under extreme controlled conditions with dramatic results. And obviously, any experiment in that space has to turn to Eastern knowledge, has to turn to yoga, has to turn to the chakras and the subtle bodies and subtle energies and all that which is so well organized and developed, and the means to develop those capacities. So we're speaking of things which are raw science on one level, and then suddenly these terms pop up which refer to yogic traditions and knowledge. And in a few minutes, I figured that this man is also a practitioner of yoga, is practicing deep meditation, and has been in this line for a long time. It was clear that the kind of breakthroughs he's been able to make would not be possible if he was not already a practitioner of yoga and did not himself have certain experiences or even, I will say, sensitivities, intuitions and capacities of consciousness.
So that the double-blind experiments have no validity anymore?
To those of us who see things from a consciousness perspective, double-blind is at best a support, as a help. But more seriously, there is this thing called what's it called? The effect.
The consciousness of the view of the practitioner.
Yes.
Is affecting the result.
Yes, yes. But the expectation of the result changes the outcome, and there's what they call the placebo effect. Okay. If I give you a medicine and say this is a medicine which will have this result, there's a certain effect. If I give you a sugar pill and say this is a medicine which will have this result, something like 60 to 70% of the time it will have the same effect as the medicine. Now this placebo effect is one of those things which science tries to filter out. You see, in this whole pursuit of objectivity, you're filtering out the subjective dimension which actually hits 60 to 70% of the result. You're eliminating that in order to get to this 30-40% benefit which is from the hard material component only. And anybody who comes from the consciousness and subjective side will say, but isn't that much more powerful than the purely objective material component? Why not actually enable it, tap into it, draw it consciously into the process? In the use of medicine, why not activate consciously the placebo effect to great advantage? This kind of thinking is unacceptable to the purely objectivists, but is not only acceptable to, but is sought for by those who are already exploring the subjective domains. Now, all of this is preparing for answering what you spoke of. In the East, that is much more common and accepted, at least in the masses. The question is really whether it can be the cutting edge in the development of the sciences or explorations. So I gave a few examples of how in the West you have individuals who are already in that alignment. In the East you have a mix. You have the scientists who were trained in the hard materialist thought process, and then there is the new generation of scientists who are more aligned to the natural, subjective, cultural background and training. And it is in this space that you are going to see the advantage and the breakthroughs. But generally speaking, all these countries that you have spoken of are the ones who have that background of the subjective space. Mother spoke of the Russian temperament as being deeply mystical.
Yes.
And equally with the Chinese, there is a natural turn to things which are of the higher ranges of the mind. Not so much an internal emotional subjectivity, but the abstract thinking of the mind, which has a perception of something which is a touch of the infinite perhaps, and a touch of the transcendence of form. So a mind which is so formed can easily break through these superficial barriers and play with deeper realities. I don't know if you recall this incident that Mother narrates when she was on the ship. I think she was heading for Japan, and there was a evangelist or one of those
Yes, I remember.
who was saying that he was going to go to China to teach people about God.
Yeah.
And Mother's comment that they're already a race that has developed their own very highly sophisticated concepts of God, and this is almost childish what he was bringing to them. And so you will find in these spaces, although a different approach, but already an opening to the deeper realities. So let's get to specifics. In Russia, well before the Second World War, there was already an extensive exploration of parapsychology.
Oh yes, telekinesis, all kinds of
Open experiments, openly experimenting with all these, to try to understand, to try to replicate, and then to apply them. In the late 60s, early 70s, the CIA discovered that the Soviet Union then, but centrally it was still the Russia and those temperamentally that space. The CIA discovered that they had ongoing 35 different experiments, laboratories, exploring parapsychological phenomena for military application alone. Many of them were involved in what they call remote viewing, telepathy, telekinesis, and a range of other phenomena which involved senses transcending the biology, to be able to read with your fingers, for example, and things like that. They were doing experiments with submarines. Now, this was a problem at that point. How do you communicate with someone in a submarine? Because electromagnetic waves don't penetrate that deep into the water. And they found telepathy to be effective. But they were experimenting with means to make it accessible and so on. And all this is happening at a pretty early stage, just after the Second World War. And the CIA was shocked, and they decided that they had to catch up. And so they initiated what became later on the remote viewing program, and Project Grudge and Project and so on. There were several names to it, Stargate, etc. But it was almost as if they were playing a game of catch-up. The problem was the scientists on the American side had no basis for this exploration. All they could do was pick people who had an ability and then try to figure out what's happening. Russia, on the other hand, had a basis, had a familiarity, had a space where they could accept these as normal and even expect much more as an outcome, because it's supposed to be possible. And so the forward movement of exploration was much more rapid, much more easy, without having to face resistance. In America, the remote viewers then describe at every stage that they had to prove to the military that what they were doing was actually valid and objectively verifiable. At every stage they found resistance and pretty rigid resistance. There was one colonel, if I remember right, the name was Stubblebine, I'm not sure, who was one of those who had this subjective opening. He believed, and there was a lecture that he gave to a large part of the American military senior brass, saying that this is the future of warfare, where all your electronics will become irrelevant. It will be the mind influencing objects, electronics, even the weaponry, being able to intervene directly. The mind being able to see, transcending all these machines. And as an experiment then, right there in front of that whole group, he had spoons distributed and made them go through an experiment of spoon bending with thought power. He made it happen. And he said the future is going to be far greater. We will have, and they called it super soldier programs, where people would develop the ability to dematerialize or semi-dematerialize their body to be able to walk through walls and stuff. It was crazily out there on the edge. The result was, of course, a very strong reaction from the more conventional minds, which were matter-based and couldn't recognize that these possibilities are part of the human potential. In fact, those programs did continue, but they were pushed aside into what is now called black programs, not exposed to the public, not accountable to the public. And so there are things still happening. But it was in resistance, in a space of resistance. Whereas here in Russia, in China, there is an open acceptance of such possibilities, and therefore the forward movement can be open and accepted in a widespread way.
Wasn't there even an experiment that proved that they could enter the minds of the enemy and change the mind?
Yes. There was a whole first initial experiment in what they call remote viewing. They discovered soon, and this is again going to the CIA experiments only, they discovered that viewing was not just a question of sight, it was a question of perception which transcended sight. You began to experience also states of consciousness, emotions, energies, much more than pictures. So if you entered somebody's mind to see through their eyes, you could experience their thoughts and emotions. So first discovery was that it's much more than just seeing, it's experiencing. The second discovery was when you can experience somebody else's state, you also are influencing their state with your state. And there's a kind of a mixture that takes place between the two. One of the problems the remote viewers faced, one of them describes this in a book that he wrote afterwards. He was tasked with remote viewing the state of mind of a certain dictator. I think it was the Middle East, he doesn't mention exactly which country. And he said, having done that and having described his state of mind and his plans, he comes out and then he's going to drive home for an hour and a half. And as he's driving on the highway, he's thinking of what he has to do. And he says, I have to get home, I have to do this, I have to do that, kill my wife, and then go to sleep. And then suddenly there's this shock. What did I just think? And so he stops the car right there on the edge of the highway and tries to figure out where did this come from. And he realized that in that moment of identification with that dictator, he had caught the imprint of his consciousness and his thoughts, and he was infected with it, not realizing what had happened. And he said that's when he went through a process of disengaging consciously. And he notes in his book that 2 weeks later, the wife of that dictator mysteriously vanished and was not heard of again. So it was obviously a part of his thought process, So they realized quickly that not only they were getting imprinted, but the reverse could be also done, that they could influence somebody's thinking. And if you put this in the hands of the military, what do you expect will happen? And of course, then they have to develop means to protect themselves from such influences. And it gets very messy. The whole thing becomes almost a raw, occult battle. Shifts from purely material to an occult level. Another example which they have documented was they were tasked one of the persons who was working there had received a kind of what they described as a kind of an attack or an intervention from somebody else. And so they were tasked with finding where did this come from. They traced it to a location in Russia, in a building, and so the remote viewers were tasked to find out who it was or what was their intention. And this person projects himself inside the building, gets to the office, discovers there's a woman sitting there who's like a psychic who was doing this work to observe them. He now observes her, and in that state of observing her, he realizes that she has become conscious of his presence. And from her side, there's as if this push, and he quickly backed off. And there was a whole thing that took place between them. Much later, after the end of the Cold War, they met physically and they exchanged notes of that event. But he said, this thing which happened, it was almost like an occult battle. He could not report it to his superiors because they would have shut down the program in fear of what this means, because it's too far beyond their conception. So I'm giving this example only to show you how the difference of mindset or the cultural values being more materialistic and objectively seated or being more subjectively centered can make a huge difference in terms of the forward movement of present technologies. And particularly as humanity itself moves to the subjective space, suddenly the subjective means are becoming more powerful. Now, I've given examples which are more on the military side, but consider other things such as well-being or health or interpersonal relations. And this is something which I find very difficult to manage. If you go to a space like France, where any vocabulary that refers to things of the subtle domain is not only dismissed offhand but is feared, because the culture has gone through that passage of eliminating religion, and with it all the rest that comes with it. It has to be purely rational and materialistic. So you use terms like a presence or an influence of an environment or thought forms, energy forms. It's scary for many people. Unless you reduce it to a vocabulary which is almost physical. Energy is okay. So you can speak of energies. So you can say that, for example, when we sit down and we are happy, then we leave behind an energy which is positive. Now what that means, they don't care. But it's within the range of acceptable vocabulary. You speak of crystals, you say energy. Everything is reduced to energy because that's physical. But they think of it also as a physical energy, not as something of a higher grade. And so you have to as if dumb down and reduce everything to a level that is almost health-based, biology-based, matter-based, energy-based. The things of the spirit have to be at best mildly hinted at, and then you leave it at that. You come to the other space and you can talk directly. You can speak of how thought forms interact with thought forms, how energy is released, engage with energies, modify each other, the whole world of the vital or mental domains and how they influence the physical. You can speak of it so freely, it's almost like a relief. Or from there to move to the sense of the concept of the self and spirit. It's a relief to be able to even share those things. So when I look at these spaces, it's clear that in the emerging future, the individuals and the collectives which have a sense of comfort and familiarity with the subjective space will have the greater advantage.
I wanted to ask rather interesting question, and that is, in this new creation, what do extraterrestrials have to do with the forwarding and realization of the new world?
The Mother and Sri Aurobindo have both made references to a life elsewhere and the focus of their work. I think it is Sri Aurobindo who says something to the effect that in this incarnation their focus is primarily for the earth. but suggesting that there could be incarnations equally where the action is intended for a larger range of planets, and therefore civilizations, interstellar civilizations and species even of life forms. In the mother's observation, similarly, she speaks of the special place that the earth has in the universe, because it is a focal point for the experiment of the development of the psychic being as the primary basis of evolution. Sri Aurobindo in the Life Divine refers to two different mechanisms of evolutionary development. Now, all of this has great import with what we are discussing. Most people don't realize these connections, though. There can be, as Sri Aurobindo describes there can be two forms of evolution. There is an evolution where a species grows because of the collective change through the generations. And then there can be an evolution of an individual because of the psychic being which is organized. And the two can be completely independent, or there can be also kind of a mix between the two. And so when we look more deeply at this question, we recognize that Earth is special because the majority of human beings have a individualized psychic being. But it is not so in all, not only on Earth, but also in other planets and other species of beings, conscious, intelligent beings, where there may be a collective consciousness, a collective identity.
But not evolutionary.
Evolutionary, but collectively evolutionary. So the group moves forward rather than individuals making an effort. And many who are visiting the earth are coming with that kind of a consciousness and have a great struggle in trying to understand the human individualization of the psychic being. So they come with a curiosity, first of all, to know, to understand, even to participate. There are some species, though, which have that, similar to the human being, in which case they come out of concern to help or even to protect us from our own stupidity. And one of the things which they have been most concerned about is, ever since we discovered the nuclear power and nuclear weapons, it was a very dangerous passage. It was just beginning with the Second World War, but particularly towards the end of the Second World War, where the whole race to build more and more nuclear bombs had started. In spaces where the nuclear weapons were kept or processing was done, you had lots of events of flying saucers appearing, monitoring, occasionally intervening. And one example which is documented, this is all part of declassified documents now from the US military. One of the examples was where on a base which had all the Minuteman missiles, and these were missiles which could, one single missile had many nuclear weapons. Minutemen.
Yes.
Many of these spread out. So the UFO appears on the base, and of course all the alarms go off and they are all moving to protect the base from who we do not know. And suddenly the power fails. The entire base goes black. Now all the missiles have their own backup power, so that nothing can stop it. Once it's released, it's the end of the world. So and suddenly all the missiles shut down. And they're seeing all this helplessly. All their weapons, all their technology fails. This thing stays for a few minutes and then it moves off. And at that point the power comes back, the base is operational again, but the missiles have stopped functioning. And so they went to study what happened in the missile, and they found the computer chips inside had been melted, they had been fused. They had just been knocked out completely. And all this thing did was to stay there and go away. So at first the reaction would be, what if it's the Russians with a new weapon, right? Except that at the same time in Russia, you had the same thing happening, a UFO coming, knocking out all the missiles. And so when they spoke on the hotline, they discovered the same thing had been done to both. And so there were many such incidents in which there were interventions, as if saying, okay, stop your stupidity, move to something more reasonable. There's another example which is again part of the declassified, or there are people involved in these programs who have come out now and spoken of it openly. They were testing one of the most advanced missiles, and as the missile took off, it was supposed to be a nuclear missile, and it was going to be one of those which would be the most rapid. As it took off and as it's moving, suddenly this UFO comes, hovers just above it, following exactly the path, then goes zip, 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 4 positions, and moves off, and the missile tumbles out of control and crashes. Just like that, with all the telemetry watching this, and the whole thing was of course classified. But the message was, look, your best missile is nothing compared to the means we have, and stop this meaningless race to destruction. When their attempts to communicate in this way, even directly sometimes with leaders in the world, failed, there was a period, particularly we see this from the 1950s up to the late 1990s, where beings from other planets met with people on Earth to convey this message that you have to stop this nuclear race, you have to dismantle nuclear weapons. And if you look at some of that literature, and I've been through a lot of this in great detail, it's quite fascinating. A lot of it is also validated by subsequent technological developments. One of the things which they pointed to was the appearance of the ozone hole long before it was actually detected. They warned of this. They warned of many other destructive effects of the nuclear weapons. Now, at that time in the 50s, up to the 50s, the US was exploding nuclear bombs on the surface of the Earth openly. And in Texas, there were these spaces where there would be a nuclear explosion, and maybe 20 miles away, there would be a town. The residents of the town would be given specs to come and watch safely the nuclear explosion. No one is concerned, or no one is telling them about the dangers of the radiation or the fallout which is going to happen. And the military was checking what was the result on the people in the long run from exposure to the fallout. Now, this is inhuman, but well, it was being done. And all kinds of experiments to make these explosions larger and larger. And each time it was spreading this very fine nuclear fallout material into the Earth's atmosphere. The practical result of which is that everywhere on Earth are these fine particles which are spreading radiation and poison and entering into all functions of life everywhere, in all creatures. Soil, water, and into the genetic structures. And there's no way you can avoid this. You breathe air, and you are breathing now air which is filled with this poison and radiation. Now, one of the things which, the messages which came from these beings from other planets speaking to human beings, saying that your scientists have only discovered the most crude part of the nuclear radiation. Even if you have a nuclear power reactor, you're protecting from alpha, beta, gamma waves. That's only the crude part. There's a much finer radiation which you have not yet detected, which is actually eating into matter, which actually weakens the metallic structures of encasement. And that escapes your containment vessel and enters the environment and enters into all life processes. And they speak of what will happen as a result of this. They say first your weather patterns will change. Your weather will become much more extreme and unstable, which of course has happened. The second, they said, as these things enter into life processes, you will have an increase of diseases, including cancer, which also is validated. But they said, because it works at a genetic level also, you will find suddenly that the smaller insects will begin to become much larger. And the more aggressive forms and more poisonous forms of these insects will increase. Whereas the more gentler types, the weaker ones would tend to fade out. Now, I've been observing this because after I read this, I said, okay, but is there evidence to this? This was stated in the 50s. I'm observing for the last 20 years. consistently from all over the world reports of unusually large insects, and for reasons we don't understand. Of course, we can generally say it is the increasing poisons which we're dumping into water and all that, hormonal particularly, which would modify growth rates and things like that. You see the bees, for example, in America, you have now the bees which are more poisonous, more violent, which have taken over, and the milder original bees have become less.
Yes, we've seen that.
Some of it has been because of imports from other countries, yes. But there's something which is happening which some of it can be purely from general toxins being poisoned, but a lot of it is also related to the effect of the nuclear poison that is put out in the air. Now the result of this, why I'm going into this in detail, suddenly out of the blue, all the countries which had nuclear weapons and were doing these tests came together and made an agreement not to do open air tests. And this was at the end of the 50s. All of them, Russia and America, were fighting each other in the Cold War. Suddenly they agreed to do, and no reason was given. And it was the result of this pressure which came from, and the evidence which was provided by extraterrestrial beings through other human beings all over the world. Many of them were asked to write to world leaders, giving documentation, evidence, and so on. But the result of that pressure was it was actually done, with one exception. In 1956, USA, Russia, France, together, jointly exploded 3 nuclear weapons, open air, on a height over Antarctica. Now here's a joint program. How do you explain that? They were enemies. Why 3 nuclear weapons at the same time over Antarctica? And why high up in the air? And the reason was never given. The technological or the military objectives were never defined. Even if there were, why would opposing camps suddenly work together for this? I found this very interesting. It was in the late 50s, early 60s, a Brazilian contactee was given a lot of this information, and there's a lot of technological details also which are fascinating. One of the things they said, all of your nuclear weapons exploded so far have been on the northern hemisphere. And because of the nature of the Earth's magnetic field, a large part of the radiation will stay contained in the northern part. Its effect on climate will be overall warming. It will eventually lead to the melting of the poles. But your southern poles are not melting fast enough. The result will be the rotation of the Earth will be unbalanced. And they said to them, actually, if you want not to have this unbalancing and the Earth's pole suddenly shifting, you should blow a few nuclear weapons on the south pole, just so that you counterbalance this. It's the one place I found this description. I said, that makes a lot of sense. And it's about 2 years later that you have this event taking place. Of course, the side effect of this was the opening of the ozone hole, which was not just from chlorofluorocarbons, which is what they've tried to eliminate. It was also the side effect of the nuclear weapons, which they will not speak of, because then the governments would be held accountable. So this is just to give an example of the kind of intervention that has been taking place. The purpose of most of these interventions have been positive, to help humanity, to help awaken, protect, etc. To put it in context, it's not the first time in the history of the universe that a planetary awakening has come to this stage of the rational mind, the development of physical sciences, the discovery of nuclear weapons, and obviously the attempt to destroy each other. It's not the first time. It's happened many times before. It's happened even on Earth many times before, including the Atlantean conflicts and so on. So it's reasonable to assume that if there are civilizations which have been here longer than us, that they would be wanting to prevent all such awakenings from destroying themselves. And so a lot of the contact or the visits from UFOs from other civilizations or planets have been coming for this purpose, to protect, and some for observing, some for helping. But it seems to be part of a kind of a universal spiritual law that they cannot interfere They can intervene, they can give guidance, they can, up to a point. But after that, it is finally the choice of the human beings.
Well, I'd like to bring up 2 points. One, they see the ozone layer is closing now.
Yes.
And the second is, Mother says we're breathing the atmosphere of the supramental now and taking that in.
Yes. There's an interesting letter. Somebody asked Sri Aurobindo, will the supramental being be radioactive? Something like that. And it's a strange question because this is the time when the nuclear weapons had just been put to use and all. And fortunately, he asked the question. And Sri Aurobindo's answer is fascinating. I cannot, unfortunately, remember the exact wording. But the content of the answer was that the supramental consciousness will make use of whatever means are available. And there is nothing in the means which is contrary to it, because it is the consciousness which synthesizes and harmonizes everything. And if there is this, radiation component, well, it can make full use of it also. That's the idea behind that, his response. Equally, the mother's observation, this is recorded in the agenda, she said one day she woke up, one morning she woke up, and there was this horrible stench in the atmosphere. Now remember, she's not living only in the material level, but all the subtler worlds. And then she went to investigate the source of the stench. And the Chinese had just exploded a nuclear bomb very close to the border near India. And it is the thing released by the nuclear bomb which had spread the stench in the subtle physical world. And she said she spent 2 hours containing that and preventing its spread into the world. Now, first of all, this gives us a much deeper understanding of what exactly nuclear weapons do. It's not just a physical explosion. There are impacts of this because of the nature of the energy involved. There are impacts of this on the subtle physical as well as the vital and mental domains. It shakes up completely the whole range. And the beings and the harmony which has been built up over millions of years on all these levels is broken to various degrees. And there's a chaos that is generated. As a result, those beings which preside over physical processes being disturbed, the physical processes also get disturbed, such as rain and climate processes and even life processes of plants and so on. The impact of this is actually spanning many of these levels. The mother intervened on that level which was subtle physical to contain the stench which was being spread. What does that mean, to contain it? It had already spread enough that she was experiencing it in Pondicherry, meaning it had spread to a large part of the earth. One explosion. Even before the physical air spreads, on a subtle physical level, the poisons released have already spread. And that she was able to gather and contain over 2 hours of effort. And then she made some other comments about the force behind that and so on. But it shows you the nature of the, let's say, the supramental consciousness, being of course working on all these levels, would take into account the poisons which have been spread, whether nuclear or chemical or otherwise, would take into account all that, not only adapt to it, but even possibly make use of it in its own change. Now, one of the things which I will point to is the release of hormones in the water. Perhaps I've mentioned this before. In the plastics which are being used nowadays, most of the plastics have a chemical structure which is very similar to estrogen. When the plastic bottles are thrown, they leach. Or even the water you drink from a plastic bottle, if you observe the transport of these bottles, soft drinks or even bottled water, you'll see them exposed to the sun for hours in the heat. And when plastic is heated and exposed to sun, you know what happens. The ultraviolet rays will break down the chemical structure, and it will leach into the water. Now, the water you are drinking is full of these leached chemicals, most of which are similar to estrogen. The result is it's like taking estrogen into the body, and it disbalances the whole hormonal system. In the USA, many of the lakes now have levels of this plastic estrogen so high that the fish are having it's messing up the gender of the fish. There are fish which have male organs and female organs at the same time, or they're switching sex halfway through. They start with one and switch into the other gender, and all of this is messing up their balance, messing up life processes completely. But the question you have to ask is, what's it doing to human beings? And you see something, I don't know if it is, if one can speak of this openly, but there is a whole shift taking place in the sense of gender consciousness or gender identity in a way that seems to be unhealthy. And a lot of this could be the result of the mix of these hormones coming in through plastics and through other foods, disrupting the natural biological balance. Now, having said this,
yes,
I'm putting it in the context.
Strong statement.
But it's true.
Yes.
Putting it in the context of the supramental, the mother spoke of the supramental being as being essentially genderless.
Yes, sexless, yes.
Mm-hmm. Meaning, in terms of consciousness, of course, it is able to express the full spectrum of what the range that the genders are, of which the genders are only specialized extremes. But also, it does not need, therefore, organs for procreation. So, the consciousness of the supramental being may still express the feminine or masculine tendencies according to the nature of what it wants to manifest, but would be essentially genderless. Mother spoke of this from a different context. She said, when she was asked, what would be the first signs of the supramental working in matter? She gave two indications. First, she said change of weather patterns, and this was in the 60s she spoke of this. And what she said was fascinating, so I'll digress and then we come back to the second point, which is what I'm interested in. She said the earth temperatures would become more, the extremes would become less and the climate would become more temperate. That means the places which are extremely cold would warm up, places which are extremely hot would cool down. And so obviously you have melting glaciers because it's extremely cold. On the other hand, you have deserts where you have rains beginning. Something is happening. And one of the outcomes of that would be eventually, she said, snow in Oroville.
Yes.
Okay. So she is foreseeing a major shift in the global weather patterns, of which she only is giving you a hint. And interestingly, in the military experiments with remote viewing, when they tried to project themselves to view the future, they saw the earth completely different with a much more temperate climate all over the earth. The extremes of seasons becoming less and less as the future trend. So that's one side, and that would be the working of the supramental consciousness in spite of all other human interventions which are causing climate change. The other side was, Mother said, the effect of supramental consciousness on matter will be on the human body. The human body form will change. It will become more androgynous. The exaggerations of the male and female forms would become less. And she said, the first signs of this will be seen in those who are working on the body consciousness, such as gymnasts and athletes. Now, for us, the evidence is obvious. You look at the Olympics, you look at a gymnast about to do their thing and you're not sure if it's a he or a her.
Yeah.
Most cases. Okay, many of them are teenagers, but even those who are older, it's not always obvious. It's as if the body becoming more conscious opens to the influence of the supramental more easily, and its working on the body is to make it more androgynous in form, closer to the archetype of the pure human body form, which is obviously genderless essentially. Now, I'm connecting this to what we discussed earlier. The means of these poisonings, this estrogen-like plastic effect in the waters, etc. On one level, it would poison and destroy life eventually. On the other level, because the supramental consciousness is working, it can make use of this to bring about a change, perhaps more rapidly, in the biological form itself, in the direction that it chooses. Now, this is the thing which we have to be very careful to differentiate. There is a poisoning process which is destructive, and then there is a greater power. If it was not there, the destruction and end of life on earth would be certain. But there's this greater power for which any means, including the means that oppose to it, are means that it can use for its development. You see? We have to understand the nature of the supramental working. Any power we have, we may come with, even a great spiritual power or psychological power. If the power works and is opposed by another power, well, you have a collision, because they are different powers. But the supramental power is a power which includes all powers. It is the oneness that knows the multiplicity. Anything that comes to oppose it is already its power in its oneness. So the harder you come to oppose it, the more quickly it gets the result that it wants. It uses your strength, your energy, your intention, however perverted it may be, it can use it to pull out of that the result that it wants. And this is the strange thing. If you come with a great force to oppose it, that very intensity will be used to hasten the transition. Except the passage may involve some kind of appearances of destruction or breakdown of things, because obviously the old forms have to break down before the new forms can fully emerge. And so when you see increasing strife or struggle, to me that's not something to worry about. It means rather there is a hastening of the process. If the process was too slow, you would see a little bit of tension, a little bit of pressure developing, building over a long time. That's a slow process. But when you see suddenly everything intensified and colliding, I'll say, okay, now there's hope. It's going to happen soon. Because inevitably there has to be, when things become so extreme, there has to be something which gives way. And a new harmony has to emerge.
Yet you have a country like North Korea setting off blasts all the time.
Yes. And so we do have these extreme corners, which are, let's say, the hiding places of the Asuric energies. And they are not always obvious. You see, when the Second World War ended, Sri Aurobindo described the ending not by saying, oh, it's been defeated. He said, now that the danger has receded, meaning it's not gone away, it's still sitting right there, waiting for its next opportunity. Where does it hide? When it's been exposed here and doesn't have its space to act freely, where does it hide? It goes underground. It puts on masks of the good and the happy and the acceptable. Many of them, in fact, went to form what became the multinationals. The very same forces which created the Second World War are now presiding behind the multinationals and working through those fronts to do exactly the same thing. So where do they hide? They create their own hiding, not always obvious. But there's some which are more obvious, like these pockets which are isolated from the overall global forward movement, and North Korea was one of those. There are a few others, many in Africa still, Central African Republic and some other regions which are completely cut off, which have become almost the den for the dark energies to hide and to, so to say, consolidate their power. But there are few such pockets. And yet, the force penetrates eventually, and you see today, for the first time, North and South Korea representing together in the Olympics. And what triggered it? So I'm coming to this as a conclusion of what we were discussing about the poisonings and all that. The supramental force will use that even as a means. It doesn't mean that the poisoning is a good thing. It's a bad thing. It is harmful. It's making the transition and the survival of life more difficult. But the supramental force will even use that, including the poisons in the atmosphere from the nuclear weapons. And so I'm coming to Mother's observation on this. After that observation of what came from the Chinese explosion and the stench, Mother spoke about it a little more. She said, exploding nuclear weapons is contrary to the evolutionary intention of nature. Nature has taken billions, not millions, billions of years to create the habit of stable atomic and subatomic structures. Now you have to understand what this means. So-called laws of physics are not laws, they are merely habits of nature. Nature has repeated those patterns so many times over billions of years that they have become now entrenched as the habit in the physical energy of the world, of matter. And the result is this stable appearance of atomic structures pretty much similar everywhere in the universe. And she says every time that you break these using the nuclear bomb, you're breaking that habit, weakening it, and loosening the bonds of the atoms. Because if you force something to happen here, the habit is something which is universal. The habit experiences its loosening across the universe. Now it's interesting, in many of these contacts from the UFOs, the beings spoke of this. You may blow your bomb on Earth, but it's affecting us on Venus and on other planets, because the impact of it is actually spreading much wider. What that was not obviously stated, but what Mother says gives you a deeper insight what's really happening. And then after saying this, and she says it's against nature, it's harmful, etc. After saying this, she says something cryptic and fascinating. She says, but perhaps this will be used in the new creation to make a much more flexible creation. You can see what that means. Matter had a rigidity of its habit. Now human stupidity has weakened that, and the supramental force will use it to make for something more flexible in the new creation. Fascinating.
Yes.
So the hope for us really, for the earth, for the future of humanity and the future of the universe really, is this possibility that the supramental consciousness brings. And I believe that even for the beings coming from other planets and other species outside the earth, they're seeing something happening here. They may not necessarily understand the full scope of it, but they're seeing something happening here which is unprecedented and which has its implications for the whole universe. And Mother said the earth is like a focal point for this experiment of the individualized psychic being as the framework of evolutionary development. So it has its implications for the whole universe. And that's the reason why so many of these beings are coming to watch.